On today's show, should the Houston Rockets make a trade for Paul George? A little bit of reporting out there suggesting that the Rockets could be one of the teams in the running for PG-13 this summer. What a deal could potentially look like, why it kind of makes sense on both sides for the Clippers and for the Rockets. We're going to tackle all of that on today's Locked On Rockets.
This is Mission Control, Houston.
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Should the Houston Rockets trade for Paul George? That is the question on today's episode. What's up, and welcome to another edition of Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. As always, I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, native Houstonian and credentialed media member. I'm also the host of Locked On NBA Mondays. Be sure to follow along wherever you listen to your podcasts, including YouTube. Just search Locked On Rockets. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, where I want your thoughts. Should the Rockets trade for Paul George? Let me know in the YouTube comments, and maybe your opinion will change by the end of today's episode. We'll see. A lot to tackle, a lot to get into, a lot of logistics surrounding this possibility for the Rockets this offseason. Now, today's episode is brought to you by Monopoly Go, the fast-paced game that lets you team up with friends for tournaments to unlock awesome prizes like unique stickers, cool playing pieces, and hilarious emojis. So download Monopoly Go now free on the Google Play Store or the App Store. Again, go grab Monopoly Go. And as always, thank you so much for making Locked On Rockets part of your day every single day. Thank you for being an everydayer, whether it's on your way to work, on your lunch break, in the gym. Thank you for making the show part of your day every single day. All right. So let's set the table here a little bit. Should the Houston Rockets trade for Paul George? I think it's a lot more complicated than a straight up yes or no answer. And I think to really understand how things could potentially look in this deal, we have to explore why we're even talking about Paul George in the first place. First off, the Clippers did flame out in the first round. And I suggested on social media before the first round series between the Mavs and Clippers was even over, I said, hey, if the Clippers flame out here, maybe the Rockets should take a look at PG-13 if he wants out, because he has a player option on his contract. And therefore, he has the ability to opt in to that final year of his deal and then be traded to potentially a destination of his choosing. Very similar to how James Harden this past season opted into the final year of his contract with the Sixers, and they ultimately traded him to the LA Clippers, or even a few years back, how Chris Paul opted into the final year of his contract, and then he was subsequently traded to the Houston Rockets. So the Rockets don't necessarily have to be a team that's going to be able to clear max cap space to sign PG-13 outright. However, the threat of the opt-in and trade only works if there are teams out there that would potentially be willing to pay PG-13 top dollar for his services in free agency. Now, there was reporting from Mike Scotto of USA Today. Here's the specific verbiage on his reporting. George could also have a larger market than only teams with cap space this summer. Theoretically, George could opt into his contract and be traded with the understanding that he'd work out a new deal, which would open up possibilities for teams like the Kings, Heat, Rockets, Mavericks, and others looking to acquire another star to fortify their championship contending chances going into next season. So, for the opt-in and trade threat to work for PG-13, you need teams who are willing to pay for him outright in free agency. And right now, there's already reporting that suggests that the Orlando Magic and the Philadelphia 76ers would be two teams right there at the top of the pecking order who both have the ability to clear the cap space, which would be just under $50 million for his max value. They could clear the space and they could make a run at PG-13. Now, the way this works is maybe PG-13 doesn't like the idea of playing for the Sixers or playing for the Magic. Maybe he's not interested in either of those destinations, but he could still use them as a leverage tactic, as a scare tactic to get the Clippers to trade him to his actual desired destination. Now, we already know that PG-13 has an affinity for both Jalen Green and Alperen Sengun. They've both been on his podcast. He said great things about both of them, incredibly high praise from one of the current stars of the league looking towards the future of the league for Jalen Green and Alperen Sengun. We know he likes them. We also know that Ime Udoka, as a coach, has a ton of pull in the NBA landscape. He's a guy that players are like climbing over each other to try and play for. He's a guy that probably has a lot of pull. So you mix in those factors and you look at the Rockets, and conceivably, I think you could convince a guy like PG-13 that the Rockets, with adding him to the mix, could be a team that could do something really, really special next season. So that's why a deal kind of seems like it could come together. We're going to get into the logistics of the deal here in just a moment, because I do think there is, and then when you're looking at it from a Rockets perspective, if you could add PG-13 to this team without giving up any of the core 6 pieces, I think it's a slam dunk. You do that deal in a heartbeat, because you'd be looking at adding PG-13, a piece that brings in a lot of shooting, a lot of playmaking ability. He's still a star level player, even though he's 34 years old. He would be able to upgrade that one position of the Houston Rockets, the small forward position, which is kind of the only position that the Rockets are in a position that they're in a position to upgrade. That's a great tongue twister. It's kind of the only spot on the floor that they're in a position to be able to upgrade without going for a true blue superstar talent, right? Because unless you're able to get a superstar 2 guard to replace Jalen Green, or a superstar center to replace Alperen, those guys are here to stay, right? You're going to bank on their high-end outcomes and waiting to see can they reach their ceiling, especially after how Alp played this past season, how Jalen Green looked post All-Star break. The Rockets are going to run it back and kind of see how those guys look, unless a bigger fish becomes available. We'll maybe tackle some Devin Booker speculation on a different episode, but we're going to keep things focused on Paul George, because I do think it makes a lot of sense for the Rockets to at least kick the tires and see what a deal could ultimately look like. Again, we set the table here. The Rockets would not be pursuing him in free agency. They would be pursuing him via opt-in and trade. It would require PG-13 to list the Rockets among potential other teams as teams that he would be willing to be traded to if he were to opt into his contract. And again, he has to have the threat of teams that are willing to sign him outright in free agency in order to go back to the Clippers brass and say, hey guys, look, I want to walk to one of these 2 teams. They're willing to pay me top dollar, or I can opt into this deal and you can trade me to one of the places that I want to go. Here's my list of teams. If you can make it happen with one of those teams, then trade me and you'll actually get some pieces back instead of losing me for absolutely nothing. That's exactly what happened with Chris Paul a few years ago. That's exactly what happened with James Harden this season. So there is some leverage there for PG-13 to work with. Could Houston be on his short list of teams? It seems like it. What would a deal ultimately look like, though? From the Rockets' perspective, what would be a deal breaker? What would be too much to pay for PG-13? We're going to tackle that here in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by Monopoly Go. In Monopoly Go, you can team up with friends for time tournaments where you work together to build up each other's boards. The more you win together, the more awesome prizes that you unlock, and there's so much to get your hands on. Unique stickers that you can trade with friends to complete albums for big prizes, cool new playing pieces to travel the boards with, hilarious emojis for taunting your friends. Plus, Monopoly Go feels new and exciting every single day with constantly changing tournaments and different challenges. A ton even include their own unique minigames, like digging for treasure or a robot pachinko machine. And there's always new timed events that help you win big, like massive multipliers for everything you win or rent frenzies. There's always something fun to discover in Monopoly Go, so get off the bench and go download it now, free on the Google Play Store or the App Store. Again, go download Monopoly Go, free on the Google Play Store or the App Store. Today's episode is also brought to you by FanDuel. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel's giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Because right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and so much more. Right now, you can take a look at the outright betting favorites to win the NBA championship this season. The Celtics still the favorites at plus 100. The Nuggets just behind them at plus 500. And the Minnesota Timberwolves making a name for themselves after their Game 1 upset against Jokic and the defending champions at plus 550. So right now, if you want to check out those odds, anything else that tickles your fancy, go visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. And continuing on here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast, home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. All right, so we kind of set the stage for how a Paul George trade could function to the Houston Rockets, why it kind of makes sense, and why we're even discussing it in the first place with the potential opt-in to the final year of his contract and the market for PG-13 right now. So what would a trade ultimately look like, right? If PG-13 gives a short list of teams, the Rockets and maybe a couple other teams, to the LA Clippers saying, hey, trade me here or I'm walking for nothing in free agency, what would that deal ultimately look like? First off, I think I'm a firm proponent of, again, do not touch the core six unless there is a bona fide all-star level player available. PG-13, while he is still a star level player, he's also 34 years old. He's in the back half of his career. This is not the type of player that you mortgage young future potential stars for, right? That's not the deal here. So if LA starts asking for any of the young core six, you immediately hang up the phone, you're done, right? However, I think you could very easily make an argument that the Rockets could put together a fairly attractive package to keep the Clippers at least relatively competitive by replenishing them, by giving them some added depth pieces, what have you, a serviceable replacement level starter in Dillon Brooks. And arguably it might be the best package of the bunch when you look around at the other teams that might be in the running for PG-13. Because again, the Rockets could easily put together first off, it would include Dillon Brooks flat out. So you're including Dillon Brooks in this deal. And then any two of Jock Landale, Jeff Green, or Jae'Sean Tate. Because for George to opt into the final year of his contract, he's making just under $50 million. The Rockets would need about $40 million in outgoing salary to be able to bring PG-13 to Houston. And thankfully, again, Dillon Brooks plus any two of Jock Landale, Jeff Green, or Jae'Sean Tate kind of gets you to that salary floor to make this trade work. But the Clippers probably wouldn't do it for just what is effectively a downgrade from PG-13 to Dillon Brooks and a couple expiring salaries, even if the Clippers planned to hold on to, let's say, the Rockets keep Jeff Green, because I'd rather hold on to Uncle Jeff. I think he's an important part for what this team did this past season. I think he's an important piece to keep moving forward. So let's make the trade Dillon Brooks, Jock Landale, Jae'Sean Tate, right? That gives the Clippers two expiring salaries in Jock Landale and Jae'Sean Tate if they elect to get rid of them. Or they could keep them, hold on to them, and actually just fold them into their rotation, right? Jae'Sean Tate is a serviceable level wing rotation piece that I think could potentially thrive with the Clippers switch everything defensive scheme. And then on top of that, Jock Landale could be their replacement for Mason Plumlee, whose contract expires this season. So there's some reasons to, like the deal outside of just getting Dillon Brooks, who is a NBA level starter. There wouldn't be much of a defensive drop off between PG-13 and Dillon Brooks. But you've got to include something of value to make this trade worthwhile for the Clippers. Now, again, the Clippers are in this weird position where they've got to try to bring James Harden back. They've already got Kawhi Leonard locked down long-term. What do you do, right? If PG-13 wants out, the best you can do is try to remain pseudo-competitive. And I think that the Rockets package allows them to do that, but you could also float them this year's Brooklyn Nets pick in the first round, and that gives them an avenue to add another piece or to potentially trade and package with any of those expiring salaries to add another piece via a different trade with another team to kind of flesh out their roster a little bit further. So effectively, the floor scenario for my deal to the Clippers would be Dillon Brooks, Jock Landale, Jae'Sean Tate, and then the 2024 Nets first round draft pick, which again, currently sitting at the 9th best lottery odds. Now, again, we do have the lottery coming up a little bit later this week on Sunday, May 12th. So the outcome of that could change, whether it could just ultimately change the value of that pick, right? If it jumps up into the top 4, then suddenly maybe we're talking about a lot more value in trade negotiations for that pick. But I feel like the Clippers could ultimately do a lot worse than that package. I also think the Rockets could up that package quite a bit if they really wanted to, right? They've still got some leftover Brooklyn Nets picks. They've even got access to their own picks much, much further out down the line. Now, I'm not saying it would take that much more to make that deal ultimately go through, because again, if PG-13 is threatening to leave for nothing, that's a pretty decent haul, right? You get a replacement level starter in Dillon Brooks. You get a pretty decent tradable asset in a first round draft pick to either bring in a piece of young talent that you can grow and mold in a Clippers jersey, or use it as trade bait in another deal down the line. You get serviceable players like Jock, Landale, and Jae'Sean Tate. I think it makes kind of a lot of sense. And again, from the Rockets' perspective, I would immediately hang up the phone and immediately deny any deal if the Clippers start asking for Jalen Green or Amin Thompson or Cam Whitmore. That feels like too much of an overpay for a 34-year-old Paul George at this point. Now, the other thing to consider when we look at the Rockets potentially doing this deal, would there have to be an understanding of a wink, kind of under the table agreement between the Rockets and PG-13 that they would ink a new contract with him next summer? Very similar to how Chris Paul did when he originally opted into his contract and was traded to the Rockets. He had a handshake agreement with Daryl Morey that they would give him a new full-length contract once he was traded to Houston, and that's exactly what they did. They gave him 4 years, $160 million, right? And then that was the contract that later on wound up, costing the Rockets quite a bit to move when they traded him for Russell Westbrook and mortgaged a ton of assets to do so. So if you're the Rockets, would you feel comfortable giving potentially a 35-year-old Paul George next summer a max deal to ride off into the sunset in Houston? Or could you potentially get him to negotiate a smaller than max deal? But if you're trying that, then why not just re-sign with the Clippers, right? That's kind of been his whole argument this whole time, is that he hasn't been willing to take less than the max on his extension talks the way that Kawhi Leonard did. So the likelihood of this trade being able to come to fruition, I don't want to say slim to none, because there is some reporting out there that suggests the Rockets would be interested. And again, at least from my own little bit of poking around, right, the Rockets are open to any ideas that would improve the roster, that would upgrade, one of their positions on the floor. And PG-13 is, in a vacuum, a significantly better player than Dillon Brooks. So if you can get PG-13 for a package like this, minimal output, right? Basically the only asset really going the Clippers' way is that 2024 Nets pick. I think it's a slam dunk deal. And again, it's not like the Clippers would have a ton of negotiating leverage if PG-13 is willing to walk in free agency to one of Philadelphia or Orlando. And I think there's an important thing to consider here when Rockets fans think about the idea of acquiring PG-13. You're not trading for PG-13, the superstar. You're not trading for PG-13, the all-star. You're trading for a PG-13 to replace Dillon Brooks and to potentially age out gracefully into a role similar to what Fred VanVleet has kind of become for this Rockets team already. More on that, as well as the potential contract extension talk, here in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by DoorDash. This Mother's Day, get something thoughtful for mom on DoorDash. Surprise her from wherever you are with fresh bouquets, the latest in tech, gift cards, self-care treats, and so much more to make her day that much better. Look, Mother's Day, really important holiday, right? You don't want to upset mom. You might have plans to take her out to a nice lunch or a special Mother's Day dinner. That's great, right? But what better way to surprise mom than to have a gift waiting for her on her doorstep the moment she wakes up on her special day? Get all of your Mother's Day gifts all in one place and get 50% off of your next order, up to $15 when you spend $15 or more on your next flour, convenience, grocery, or retail order, now with code LOCKEDONNBA using DoorDash. Again, that's code LOCKEDONNBA. Order using DoorDash today. Terms apply. And final segment here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. All right, so I kind of wish I had gotten to this point a little bit earlier, but if you stuck with me through the first two segments and you're in segment 3, I appreciate it. So let me wrap up the point about the contract extension for a moment. Even if PG-13 was only going to be a 1-year rental, let's say he gives a short list of names to the Clippers, because let's face it, does he really want to go? Does he want to go to Orlando? Does he want to go to the Sixers? That's the part that you have to weigh. And maybe those destinations are more attractive to him than coming to Houston for 1 year with no guarantee of a contract extension. That's also why I would argue that this scenario is less than likely to happen. I'm not going to say never, because again, we've seen crazier things happen in this NBA landscape. But, and again, a lot of it has to do with, I think, personal relationships behind the scenes, right? Like, does Ime Udoka have enough pull to get PG-13 to want to be in Houston? Do Jalen Green and Alperen Sengun have enough cachet as young stars in today's NBA for PG-13 to look at Houston and think, yeah, I could see myself ending my career there and let them kind of do the heavy lifting as I age gracefully into more of a supporting role with that lineup. And that's the important thing to consider here is trading for Paul George wouldn't mean trading for a guy to be your number one option. The Rockets wouldn't be trading for PG-13 to be their de facto number one or their superstar. You'd be trading for PG-13 to bring him into the fold of a system that already has veterans in place, where the goal is to lift up and complement the young guys as much as possible. That's exactly what we saw happen this past season with the additions of Fred VanVleet and Dillon Brooks and Jeff Green and Aaron Holiday. Those guys, yes, they had their moments. Yes, they had their individual games that they were able to take over, but it never felt like, aside from Fred and his role as being the floor general, it never really felt like the Rockets exclusively leaned on those guys to carry them through certain games. Obviously, Brooks would get hot, or Jeff Green could, have an awesome stretch, whatever, close out games defensively against the Pelicans or the Nuggets. Cool. PG-13 wouldn't be expected to be the head honcho, if you will, if he came to Houston. The Rockets would very clearly still be leaning on the production of Alperen Sengun and Jalen Green as their blossoming all-stars. PG-13 would be able to transition into more of a support role where he doesn't have to put up 20 to 25, 30 points a night to be able to have a chance to win games. He'd be able to simply just be in a support role where he can catch and shoot and do what he does well, which is space the floor, play good defense on the other end, right? Yeah, maybe create situationally. Yeah, if he's got a favorable advantage, then let him go to work. Let him do his thing. He's still Paul George, but instead of requiring him to be the guy every single night, which is kind of how the Clippers were built, right? The Clippers were built as a team that was just a bunch of dudes, James Harden, Paul George, Kawhi Leonard, who could all on any given night take over a game, right, and go to work. That's why they led the league in isolations this past season. Even Russell Westbrook to a lesser degree. I think it'd be a much more attractive idea for him to come to a team where he could allow other guys to do the heavy lifting, kind of how Fred VanVleet allows Sengun or Jalen or Jabari to do the heavy lifting on a night-to-night basis, but he'll step up when it's time for him to step up, right? He'll be the steadying hand when it's time for him to get a couple clutch buckets in the fourth quarter to extend a lead. That's the kind of role that PG-13 could have with this Houston Rockets team. Now, again, there's a lot of ifs, ands, and maybes and all sorts of stuff that would have to go right for the Rockets to be in a position to make this deal for Paul George, but I think it makes a ton of sense. And again, if you're on the Clippers side of things, if the threat is losing Paul George for nothing and letting him walk in free agency and you get nothing back for him, or you get back Dillon Brooks, Jock, Landale, Jae'Sean Tate, and the Nets pick in this year's draft to add a young player or to use in trade talks elsewhere to flesh out the roster, I think that trade makes a lot of sense. Now, the other element to consider here of the trade of the teams that were mentioned, the Kings, the Heat, the Mavericks, some of the other teams that could be in the running for PG-13. Can the Rockets outbid those teams, right? Or do those teams have a level of pull with PG-13 that the Rockets don't, right? I already talked about the Rockets' angles, right? The off-the-court stuff, Jalen Green, Alperen Sengun. Does he have strong relationships with those guys? Would he want to play with those guys? Would he want to come play for Ime Udoka? We know that with the Miami Heat, Eric Spoelstra is a coach that almost every NBA player would love to go play for. He's widely regarded as the best coach in the NBA, so maybe that's a team that he would have a little bit more interest in going towards. Maybe the Clippers have a little bit more, not the Clippers. Maybe the Kings have a little bit more that they would want to unload, right, to upgrade that Harrison Barnes slot in their roster on their team. I don't know how much the Mavericks have in their war chest of assets to be able to make, a roster upgrade, but would they be willing to go all in, especially if they continued, their postseason run, if they make a really deep run and they feel like they're only one move away, would upgrading PJ Washington into a Paul George be something that they'd be interested in? And ultimately for PG-13, would he want to come to a situation where a championship isn't the guarantee in Houston? Unfortunately, right? A lot of the teams on this list The Kings, who were coming off of a successful season, obviously this most recent season, very disappointing, but they were the 3rd seed just a couple seasons ago. The Heat, ton of finals experience, a lot of late postseason pushes. The Mavericks have, a top 3 MVP candidate in Luka Doncic. They've already got another star in Kyrie Irving. Maybe that's a more attractive situation overall. Nobody's really going to know. This is all speculative in nature. Only PG-13 ultimately knows what he wants, right? Is he craving a payday more than anything, right? If he's craving a payday, then the easy solution is go to Philadelphia or go to Orlando, and it doesn't matter what his championship chances ultimately look like. Just go to one of those situations. Although I will say that with where the Sixers are currently at, yes, Tyrese Maxey's a really exciting, young, blossoming all-star in his own right. Yes, Embiid is the reigning MVP. Well, was the reigning MVP. I just don't know. That Sixers situation seems like it's brewing and could ultimately explode if Embiid demands out or gets frustrated or whatever. I feel like that Sixers situation is kind of a powder keg. Orlando would be a nice landing spot, but Orlando's also rumored to be interested in Klay Thompson. So maybe that's, a situation where if they can get Klay instead of PG-13 or get Klay at a discount, then maybe that's the direction the Magic ultimately go. We're not going to know how these chips ultimately fall this offseason, but I do think that there's a lot of reasons that this deal could make a lot of sense on both sides for the Rockets and for the Clippers. I'd like to see the Rockets upgrade that position because I do think, and this will be my final point on this. I kind of wanted to tackle this in a bit longer form, but I think I can condense it. There's a lot of Rockets fans who are hell-bent on the idea of don't do anything, run it back, let the young guys grow. And I get that. Look, I already firmly said don't touch the core 6 unless it's for like a bona fide all-star or a superstar caliber player. But ultimately, like, you have to make these hard decisions, right? You have to be willing to trade guys and upgrade your roster when an opportunity presents itself. You don't want to always be the team that's sitting on its hands. And I'll give you a couple of examples here, right? Sacramento Kings, a very recent example, right? They were sitting on De'Aaron Fox and Tyrese Halliburton. Now, I know it's a little bit different because we're talking about trading a role player in Dillon Brooks for an aging star in Paul George, but walk with me here for a moment. The Kings had to make a really difficult decision in which of their young, exciting guards they were going to keep. And ultimately, they dealt Tyrese Halliburton because nobody wanted De'Aaron Fox. And they got back Domantas Sabonis, and then they built their entire identity around De'Aaron Fox and Sabonis, and Fox also thankfully kind of leveled up again after that trade. So the Kings have experienced a lot of success since making that deal. And that was a hard deal to make, right? To trade Tyrese Halliburton, who looked like a really special player at the time. I'll give you a different example that's probably more akin to what this ultimately looks like. The Nuggets, right? They made the decision to trade RJ Hampton and Gary Harris to the Magic, as well as a future first for Aaron Gordon, right? That was the piece, that was the move that kind of pushed them over the top a little bit. And there were probably a lot of Nuggets fans who didn't want to get rid of Gary Harris, who didn't want to lose, young, exciting RJ Hampton, right? Thought he had a lot of, a high ceiling, future potential, all that. It's one thing to get really excited about the hypothetical ceiling or the hypothetical potential of players on the roster. It's another to try and look at these moves, look at these players in reality, what they're capable of right now, what we think they'll be capable of down the line. And as it stands with the Rockets, Dillon Brooks was a great acquisition. I think he played out of his mind for about 2/3 of this season, but the Rockets are also still on the hook for 3 more years of Dillon Brooks. And if this last 1/3 of the season is any indicator of what he's going to be like in a Rockets jersey moving forward, that's not really the player that you want, manning that 3 spot for the Rockets. So if there's a way to upgrade that position right now, be it for a Paul George type or anybody else who would be a direct upgrade over Dillon Brooks without giving up too much in the way of your young talent, as far as the core 6 goes, or dipping too much into your future draft capital, then I think you got to make that move. So there's going to be a lot of hypotheticals, a lot of scenarios in which we kick the tires or discuss different names that the Rockets could pursue this offseason. And I think ultimately it's really important to remember that the Rockets could stand still and do nothing, but they could also be kicking themselves if we look at this team 2 or 3 years from now and think, man, remember summer 2024, they could have traded for X name, and think about how different things could have looked, right? Think about how much more success this team could have had. Because if you look at this trade and think about a roster that includes a starting lineup of Fred VanVleet, Jalen Green, Paul George, Jabari Smith Jr., and Alperen Sengun, that's a ton of defense, length, shooting, playmaking ability. It gives another star-level player in PG for the Rockets to rely on, so that if teams are start doubling Sengun or Jalen Green, then those guys have an easier time, attacking out of those double teams. And then off the bench, you still have Amin Thompson, Cam Whitmore, Tari Eason, Jeff Green, Steven Adams, and you still have the non-taxpayer MLE on top of all of that, right? A little under $13 million, so I think it's $12.9 million this offseason. You could go sign a name, like you could bring back, a familiar face in Eric Gordon to give you kind of a combo guard role off the bench. You could go sign a shooter like Buddy Hield or Luke Kennard, or go grab a scorer like Kelly Oubre. Go grab whoever you want, right? To really add more depth and flesh out this Rockets roster. That seems like a team that could be an absolute lock for a top 6 seed next season. I still think this Rockets team could be in a really good position without making any moves next year, but and actually, let me rephrase what I said. I think that team sounds like a team that's a lock for a top 4 seed next season. We saw already a 19-win jump this year with the acquisitions that the Rockets made this past offseason. What can they do this summer to push the needle even further? I'm not talking about an all-in move. I'm not talking about a push your chips to the center of the table. This Rockets team isn't ready to make that one last move to be a ready-made contender. They're not at that point yet. But PG wouldn't necessarily be that move, especially if there's a world in which PG-13 would be open to the idea of a bit more of a team-friendly contract with the Rockets after trading and coming to Houston. Then I think that's something that you have to at least explore. But the likelihood of this deal, very slim. Wanted to still explore it. It was a topic amongst Rockets fans for these past few days over the weekend, so wanted to make sure we tackled it here on the show. I would do it, but I'd have to do it with certain contingencies. Wouldn't necessarily want PG on a super duper long-term, like $50 million plus deal as he ages out. That sounds counterproductive, to say the least. And the very last thing here to note is if the Rockets did get PG to opt into his deal and come to Houston, the Rockets would have like over $100 million of expiring salary going into summer 2025, where you've got a ton of really, really big name free agents, including guys like, I believe that's the Jalen Brown summer. I think that's Jalen Brown. I think it's Jason Tatum. I think it's Donovan Mitchell. Kyrie Irving, Jimmy Butler. There's a lot of really big name guys who are going to be free agents that summer that the Rockets would hopefully be in position to pursue. So how would you feel about a PG-13 trade? Does it make sense to you? Do you feel better about it after kind of navigating through the episode? Let me know in the YouTube comments. But as always, thank you so much for checking out the show. If you haven't done so yet, please consider subscribing wherever you listen to your podcasts, or on YouTube, just search Locked On Rockets, like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. But as always, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. And we look forward to having you back right here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball.